The main event of UFC 319 is obviously insane. Khamzat Chimaev versus Dricus du Plessis in the main event for the middleweight title, but the rest of the card is not getting the respect it deserves in my opinion because it is stacked from top to bottom with a plethora of ranked fighters and a ton of storylines to discuss. So we're going to start with talking about the rest of the card with the co-main event, as we will see Lerone Murphy putting up his number 6 ranking and undefeated record against the UFC newcomer and debutant Aaron Pico. Lerone Murphy had a draw in his very first fight in the UFC back in September of 2019 at UFC 242 Nurmagomedov versus Poirier, and since then has not looked back and has won 8 consecutive fights in a row, and the last 3 are the most impressive victories over Josh Emmett, Dan Ige, and Edson Barboza. And that win against Emmett would come in April of this year in a fight night main event where he would get the decision win over the course of 25 minutes. And Lerone truly is a very underrated, supremely underrated, dare I say, talent in not only the featherweight division, but the entire UFC. I think the biggest problem for Lerone in terms of holding him back from reaching more of a casual audience and getting his name value out there is that he only has 2 finishes out of those 8 UFC wins, and the last one was in October of 2021 against Makwan Armikani at UFC 267. But we can no longer deny the fact that Lerone Murphy is an elite level featherweight fighter, not only from an X's and O's and stylistic perspective, but now adding the names to his resume as well. And at 34 years old, he's not necessarily in the heart of his prime, but he is still at the end of those prime years and has plenty left to offer before it's too late. And he is taking a massive chance here with putting his name value on the line, his number 6 ranking on the line, and his undefeated record on the line, all to get in the good graces of the UFC in my opinion, because Aaron Pico has never fought in the UFC before. He's never fought for a Bellator championship before, but yet he is getting a silver platter gifted to him here with a number 6 featherweight in his first UFC fight. Aaron Pico will enter this co-main event of UFC 319 at the ripe age of 28, so he is just now getting ready to enter those prime years with a 13-4 record, having finished 11 of those 13 wins with 9 knockouts. Aaron Pico is a true homegrown talent for Bellator, having his professional debut with that promotion in June of 2017 when he was just 20 years old, and 17 fights later, he rode it all the way out with them / PFL, I guess, after the merger. Because the last fight that he had under the PFL / Bellator banner was last February where he would knock out Henry Corrales, so he will enter this fight on a 16-month hiatus. And he had a relatively public fallout with Bellator, as did the likes of a Patricio Pitbull and a Patchy Mix, both of whom have made their UFC debut since. Pitbull having a 1-1 record so far in the organization, and Patchy Mix losing his debut back in June. And now Aaron Pico will be the next high caliber name value signing coming over from the Bellator organization to the UFC, and arguably he's getting the biggest opportunity yet out of all of them. Yes, technically Patricio is fighting number 5 ranked former interim champion Yair Rodriguez, but Patricio is about 10 years older than Pico. And Patchy Mix was getting a Mario Bautista, who I believe was ranked either 8th or 10th, but was on a massive win streak. But Pico is getting the number 6 ranked featherweight in the world, Lerone Murphy, who is undefeated, and it's a co-main event slot on a pay-per-view. And I would say that all of the pressure is on Pico here, looking to come into the UFC and make a grand entrance upon his debut fight. But I would say there's equally, if not more, pressure on Lerone Murphy, who's taking this on short notice and putting everything on the line, including probably his only chance to ever reach title contention, because if he loses to Aaron Pico, I could see a world where he never gets this close again. But I will say that if Lerone Murphy takes this chance for the UFC and gets the job done, especially if it's in convincing fashion, he should be amongst the frontrunners to face Volkanovski for the title next. And I absolutely wouldn't be surprised that if Aaron Pico comes in on his UFC debut and beats Lerone Murphy, the first person to ever do so, dare I say maybe even finish or knock out Lerone Murphy, he could be very close to knocking on the door for Volk's title too. And they've already been talking back and forth about one another as well, so there's a little bit of a rivalry brewing already before Pico's even stepped foot into the cage. Aaron Pico's grappling and wrestling background is unprecedented. That is what he was known for coming into the Bellator organization nearly a decade ago. But to add on to that background, he has a very high caliber pedigree with the Golden Gloves boxing, so he has very powerful, strong hands and crisp boxing combinations, as does Lerone Murphy. Maybe not so much with his power, but I would say that Murphy has more weaponry on the feet in terms of elbows, kicks, knees, and he can work in the clinch and grappling as well. I think this is a very interesting clash of styles. And yet Aaron Pico, upon his UFC debut against someone as highly accredited, in my opinion at least, as Lerone Murphy, he is a near 2-to-1 betting favorite, with Lerone Murphy at the time when I bet on him was plus 154. I would love to get your thoughts and predictions on this fight down in the comments below. Will Pico crash in on his UFC debut and make a name for himself immediately, or is Lerone Murphy too much too soon? We've got another absolute banger in the featured bout, as we will see the number 11 ranked welterweight Geoff Neal taking on the number 12 ranked fighting nerd Carlos Prates, who is looking to bounce back from his first UFC loss. Geoff Neal last fought at UFC 308 in October of 2024, where he would get a victory and finish over Rafael dos Anjos. Although technically there was a knee injury to RDA that halted the fight ultimately, but Geoff Neal looked phenomenal for the minute and 30 seconds we got to see it. And prior to that, Neal had lost fights to Ian Gary and Shavkat Rakhmonov, neither of which are anything to scoff at. And Geoff Neal has fought nothing but the best of the best, essentially, especially if you want to look at the back half of the welterweight division ever since debuting in the UFC in 2018. And overall has a record of 8-4 in the UFC, and the other two losses are to Neil Magny and Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, the all-time leader in welterweight wins in Magny, and Wonderboy, a former two-time title challenger. And prior to losing the title back in May at UFC 315 to Jack Della Maddalena, Geoff Neal was the other most recent man to beat Belal Muhammad, and that was back in 2019 before his insane unbeaten streak. He's finished 12 of his 16 victories, with 10 of them by way of knockout, and he is called Hands of Steel for a reason. This one is not going to be boring whatsoever, because it will be a 15-minute or less striking affair, because Carlos Prates is one of the most lethal strikers in the welterweight division as well, because all of his UFC victories thus far have been by way of knockout. We all know that the Fighting Nerds took the UFC by storm in 2024, and leading the charge, especially in that calendar year, because Caio Borralho made his UFC debut prior to Carlos, Rufi, and Silva. Carlos Prates was 4-0 in 2024 with 4 straight knockout victories, and that included the Leech, Li Jing Liang, and Neil Magny. But the hype would halt just a little bit because he would take a short notice main event opportunity back in April against Ian Gary, where he would lose a 25-minute decision, but not before almost coming back in the 5th and final round with a knockout. He was just seconds away from potentially having the ref step in. Carlos has finished 19 out of his 21 victories, with 16 of them by way of knockout. This is an absolute banger. It's guaranteed. There's no way that this fight will be boring. For Geoff Neal, it's an opportunity to win his second straight, hold his spot right there at number 11, an inch closer to the number 7, number 6 ranked guys upon his next fight. And Carlos Prates is looking to get the biggest win of his UFC career and bounce back from his first UFC loss. There are storylines and there are stakes involved in this welterweight clash, because outside of middleweight that is taking the world by storm right now, welterweight is the second most happening weight class of the year. We've got 2 middleweights coming off of victories back in February that are wanting to get their second win of the year. It's Jared Cannonier, the former title challenger and top 10 ranked middleweight, who just knocked out Gregory Rodriguez in a main event, versus Michael Venom Page, who technically is the number 15 ranked welterweight, but having his second consecutive middleweight bout here in the UFC, coming off of that massive win over Shara Bullet in Saudi Arabia, where he would become the first man to ever defeat Magomedov. And he is back for his second consecutive stint at 185 and looking to crash into the top 10 of the division. At 41 years old, Jared Cannonier proves that he can still hang with the best of the best, whether it's longtime veterans or newly fresh up-and-comers. He fights anyone and everyone. As a matter of fact, his lone losses in the last 5 years were Robert Whittaker, former champion, Israel Adesanya, former 2-time champion, Nasruddin Imavov, potential next number 1 contender, and Caio Borralho, potential next number 1 contender, because they're fighting each other in a few weeks. But sandwiched in between all of that hoopla was victories over Kelvin Gastelum, Derek Brunson, Marvin Vettori, Sean Strickland, and of course the aforementioned RoboCop. And Michael Venom Page, even at 38 years old, has had a relatively good run so far through 3 fights in the UFC with a record of 2-1. The lone loss was to Ian Gary in a very close, some would say controversial decision. The victory over Shara Bullet, and his debut win over Kevin Holland at UFC 299. We've got the long, rangy striker and MVP that has an arsenal of weaponry on the feet, and he really mixes up his striking exchanges and techniques, versus the killer gorilla Jared Cannonier that has massive power in his hands and is going to want to close the gap on Venom Page to find his most successful path to victory. And I wouldn't be surprised if Cannonier mixes in a little bit of wrestling as well to really throw off MVP's strategy for this one. I wouldn't say that there are massive stakes necessarily for this fight, just being that MVP is a technically ranked welterweight fighter and Cannonier is number 9 right now at middleweight, but it is definitely important because of all the moving pieces at 185 right now. Especially for Cannonier, I feel like if he can't hold his spot and he falls here, he has no more opportunities to reach title contention. But if he wins, he could still have a chance, and obviously if MVP wins, he'll become ranked in 2 weight classes and jump into the top 10 of the surging middleweight weight class. And kicking off the UFC 319 main card is a very fun scrap in the flyweight division between former title challengers, the number 11 ranked Tim Elliott and the number 15 ranked Kai Asakura. At 38 years old, Tim Elliott enters UFC 319 having won 3 of his last 4 bouts, with the only loss coming to the undefeated Muhammad Mokaev. The problem here for Elliott is that he did not fight at all in 2024, so his last performance was a victory, albeit, but it was in December of 2023, over a year and a half ago now, where he would submit Suma Derji. And Kai Asakura, the 31-year-old out of Japan, former Rizin champion, made his UFC debut back in December, and he was immediately launched right into a title shot against Alexandre Pantoja. And while he did put up a pretty fun outing, he would ultimately succumb to a submission by Pantoja in the second round. But he is right in his prime and going to enter this after an 8-month hiatus, and I look for him to be very fresh. Obviously, for Tim Elliott, I would say much of the same, but that layoff is a little bit cause for concern, if you ask me, especially with someone as dangerous and well-versed as Asakura, who has finished 16 of his 21 wins. And you pair that with Tim Elliott having been finished in 7 of his 13 losses, it could be a recipe for disaster for Tim, but he could also prove doubters like me wrong and absolutely hold his spot amongst the elite fighters in the 125-pound division. But I definitely think there's more eyeballs on Kai in this opportunity because now he's getting a chance to actually get his feet wet in the flyweight division and see how he fares with other ranked fighters instead of being launched right in with the best of the world. This potential run that Kai could go on that starts at UFC 319 definitely has me intrigued.